Good day and welcome back to another Guild Wars 2 video. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the best starting classes for new players to take a look at as they get into Guild Wars 2. We'll discuss the best picks, then sort of talk around some of the other classes and obviously mention a few useful tidbits along the way. So firstly, let's talk about Guild Wars 2 leveling and class leveling in general. Firstly, all races can play all classes. There's no restriction to any race in the class they can play. Secondly, as well, Guild Wars 2 is not a game where leveling is the primary focus. Leveling your first character may take a while, but the game introduces a ton of avenues through which to level alts. The game is incredibly alt friendly once you get past that kind of initial first two characters. And then thirdly and finally, the characters you choose are always very malleable. Most classes are viable in some way, and because of the weapon system and the skill system, most classes have distinct, unique playstyles, but also can play in multiple ways, meaning classes can play as supports, or as DPS, or as tanks for the most part. Some classes obviously can't technically do all three, but some can, etc. So it's just dependent on how you want to play that class. The first class that we'll talk about, and my top pick for classes in Guild Wars 2 to start with, is the Necromancer. Now when I started Guild Wars, I actually played it as a Necromancer first. It is one of my favorite classes in the game. The Necromancer has a lot of great abilities for a single player or solo player who's looking to get started into Guild Wars. Firstly, the Necromancer has the ability to perform summons. Summons are great because of a multitude of reasons. One, they can give you pretty easy passive extra damage, but two, also, they give you some pretty good ways to distract the enemy from you. When you're fighting elites or slightly tougher enemies, having a mob pack tends to make your life a lot easier. On top of that as well, their core mechanic of the Death Shroud, which, depending on your specialization, can change, is absolutely amazing. It makes you so tanky in the open world. I remember doing events and things and being like, whoa, why am I so tanky? Why can I just not die? And it's because of this Reaper's Shroud or Death Shroud. It is incredibly powerful. It gives you a second batch of health. It lets you heal up. A lot of the times it gives you a whole bunch of different levels of tankability, and it's just really fantastic. For a light class, it has very high levels of tankiness, which is really helpful, and it has one of the best elite specs in the game, although this requires you to have the Heart of Thorns expansion in the Reaper specialization, which is probably one of the ones that players have enjoyed the most. When it first came out and I could use a greatsword on a Reaper, it was fantastic. Now, Guardians follow a very similar kind of playstyle as a Necromancer. So Guardians don't necessarily have the same type of situation with the minions and their ability to draw aggro and provide passive damage, but Guardians are great because although they have a high skill ceiling for what they are, you do have quite a lot of mechanics that are kind of baseline no matter how you play the Guardian. These are things like healing yourself, blocking damage, cleansing debuffs, and because of this and really the ability to access these without necessarily needing to have a high understanding of your class nor a high understanding of the class ceiling, you can generally just use a Guardian and kind of get by as a new player without necessarily feeling overwhelmed with the game. The Guardian's a class that's also great because later on, as you start to establish your ceiling and your high level of skill, you can look into the various aspects of whether you want to play something like a support Guardian, where you use the staff to provide buff, cleansing, and abilities to other players, or whether it is that you want to play a more damage orientated Guardian or tanky Guardian with things like the Greatsword combo. Ultimately, the Guardian does have a high skill ceiling for late game, but there is generally speaking a pretty good aspect to them for new players, whereby even without necessarily knowing the intense kind of relatability of skills, you tend to be able to get away with just knowing the baseline, as like I said, most of their playstyles don't require a ridiculous understanding of the game to be able to play. The Ranger is the third class, and now with the Ranger comes a lot of great things. The Ranger plays much like your traditional range classes do in any MMO. You have a bow, you have a pet, and from there you can kind of gather that yes, you will indeed have a pretty easy time. There's a lot of reasons for this. Your bow, or whichever weapon you choose, generally the bow, will give you range. This allows you to keep distance from enemies and examine their various playstyles from afar. Most of Guild Wars does come down to dodge rolling certain abilities. So by being able to essentially dodge roll or kind of move past abilities, you give yourself a pretty good window by studying the opposition without necessarily being in harm's way. When it comes down to the Ranger as well, your pet is a huge boost for you. Much like any other MMO, the pet is a great tank, similar to the minions for the Necromancer class. They can hold aggro, and just they provide good passive damage, whilst you are still figuring out your abilities and being able to make headway with your different skills. Ranger has some very interesting elite specs that can come over at a later stage once you're more comfortable with the class. You have the ability to go more into the realm of nature magic, and you also have the ability to stem more into just your pure kind of DPS ways. Ultimately, this is a pretty fun class to begin with if you're looking for a more structured approach that feels more akin to other MMOs. If you're someone who played Hunter in World of Warcraft, or you're looking for something that's grounded and familiar, this is going to be the class for you, because you're going to be able to relate to it a lot faster. Lastly, we are going to talk about some of the other classes. So, although I recommend starting with the Necromancer, Guardian, or the Ranger, there are still a whole bunch of other classes that players are probably going to wonder about. Now, as I mentioned in the beginning of the video, there's no right or wrong answer, but as a new player, I do want to give you some feedback on maybe why you should or shouldn't choose the other classes. So first we have the Warrior. Warrior is your traditional class, very akin to the Ranger but on a melee scale. It is super similar to any other warrior class you've played in other games, with great tankiness, with the ability to do high volume damage. The only thing is, as a new player, the Guardian has more utility and tools baked into the standard kit. Things like cleanses, things like damage reduction, things like standard healing. That makes it a bit easier to play than the Warrior, especially when you're at group event level. Next we can talk about the Thief. The Thief is a great class. It is essentially a rogue, and Thief is one of those classes that, much like Rogue in any other game, is a high risk, high reward class. You're a glass cannon. Your goal is to do as much damage as possible, and you have incredibly high single target damage. The issue with this for new players is that a lot of your early game revolves around doing events and clearing events quickly, as well as doing hearts and other things in the open world, which generally speaking, because there are other players around, you don't need such a focus on single target damage, which means it can be a bit cumbersome for new players to play. Next we have the Mesmer, which is one of the more unique classes in Guild Wars. In fact, it's so unique I've never seen anything like it in any other MMO. And because of this, it is a very confusing playstyle. It is really fun, and it's definitely a class you have to look at as a Guild Wars player, just not one for new players. Similarly, the Revenant. The Revenant is really cool looking. It is probably one that players are going to really lean towards if you've been into Demon Hunters or any edgy classes and other MMOs. But the thing with the Revenant is it has a very high skill ceiling due to its resource management capabilities. It's a very unique system, and the way it plays and its playstyle is a little bit too difficult, I would suggest, for new players. Then we come to the last two, and they both share the same problem. Engineers and Elementalists are similar in design from the concept of the fact that they both have a ton of skills. Engineers have a ridiculous number of skills. They can cycle through so many different weapons, gadgets, traps, abilities that really they are like a walking armory in their own right. And much like Mesmer, are a very unique, interesting class to Guild Wars 2. They're really fun, but because of the high volume of skills and the need to overlay those skills to ignition certain buffs, I wouldn't necessarily suggest playing as them. Then we get to Elementalist, which, if you need an example of what an Elementalist is, just watch The Last Airbender and you'll get a good idea. Essentially, you're the avatar, and you have the ability to cycle through so many different elements that just a single weapon can have almost twice as many skills as just the standard class can have. In fact, sometimes it can have even 3 times as many skills. Because of this, and because of how important it is to layer stack certain bonuses and abilities, Elementalist is a fantastic class that just requires a bit more knowledge of the game before you play it. So, no downside to any of these classes, just some may probably want you to have a bit more going on about yourself before you get involved. Like I said, there's no right or wrong way to play a class in Guild Wars, so if you have any questions or queries in the comments, you can let me know. But until then, as I say, take care, stay safe, and bye. See you guys in the next one.